Hey everyone, I'm Walt, one of the High Rock pastors. I hope you had a fantastic Easter. Last month was March Madness, and the men's and women's college basketball tournaments are some of the best action in sports. I went to the University of Maryland, which has a big basketball program. The games were always packed with a rowdy student section, and if you wanted to get into some of the big games, you'd have to camp out to get in line for tickets. When I was a student, our biggest game was against the Duke Blue Devils. We hated them. We wanted nothing more than for Coach K to become Coach L. My freshman year, my friends and I were camping out for tickets, and the line was winding all across campus. It had been a very normal ticket line experience until about 3 in the afternoon, the day before the tickets went on sale. All of a sudden, we started hearing shouts from further up the line. It sounded like people were saying they're opening the arena early, but that couldn't be right. It was well over 12 hours before that happened. And then people started running. Students were just abandoning their sights, making a mad dash for the front of the line and the doors to the arena. My friends and I looked at each other like, what are we going to do? And then we made the only choice that freshman guys could be expected to make. We started running. We hustled up towards the doors to that arena. Doors that were not open. Doors that were firmly locked. Doors that a massive group of people, including us, were pressed up against. And before we knew what was happening, we were squished in there like sardines. For about an hour, we could not move. We were totally stuck. I remember being in that crush and thinking, this was a bad idea. Thankfully, it all worked out in the end. No one was hurt. I got my tickets. We beat Duke and went on to win the national championship. Go Terps. But that moment was ridiculous. We were afraid that we weren't going to get tickets, but instead of exercising some patience and wisdom, we threw ourselves in with a bunch of other fearful people and found ourselves in a dangerous situation. We got caught up in the moment, and for fear of missing out, we allowed ourselves to be led down a potentially harmful, even deadly path. Fear is such a powerful thing. We all experience it in a multitude of different ways and in a multitude of different areas. They can be seemingly small fears, like about not getting tickets to a basketball game or a Beyonce concert. Well, maybe that has been a big fear for some of you. We can have fears about our relationships. Will this person like or trust me? Will they want me in their life or just cut me off? We can have fears about our finances or our health or the health of loved ones. We can have fears about trends in our culture or our political life or what kind of world we're leaving for future generations. There's no shortage of things to be afraid of. I'm sure we could all make a list right now of fears that feel very live for us. But what do we do with those fears? How do we respond to them? When I was with my college friends and we were afraid we weren't going to get tickets to that game, we made a bad decision. Have you ever made a decision out of fear and regretted it? And has that decision ever been influenced by other people? We saw people running for tickets, so we just joined the crowd. Everyone was running one way, so we should probably run that way too. And that's what made that situation dangerous. I haven't been caught up in any more ticket stampedes, but I think I learned my lesson. But I have let myself be caught up in other crowds of fearful people. These weren't physical crowds as much as they were ideological or social or cultural or theological crowds. We shared a common fear. There was something at stake, something that was being threatened. Maybe it was our hope of what the future should look like, or our convictions on what policies are best for our country, or how to respond to COVID, or how we understand our nation's complicated past. Perhaps it has to do with beliefs about God and the Christian life that we thought were essential and shouldn't be compromised. Maybe we're afraid of our neighborhood going downhill, what our schools are or aren't teaching, or what's going on with the job markets or the stock markets or the supermarkets. Many of these fears and concerns are important and understandable. This isn't to say we shouldn't be concerned about anything. Of course we should be. But I've seen this go sideways in my life and the lives of others when a legitimate concern or question becomes a frenzy of anxiety and fear. And when multiple groups are doing this in opposition to one another because they came down on different sides of an issue, or think the other group's fear is unfounded, or have a different solution in mind, well, then we've got a problem. Because now we aren't just caught up in our own stampede, which is in and of itself dangerous, but warring with different stampedes. There's a lot of derogatory terms that are thrown around out there, but a popular one is the term sheeple. It refers to people who are docile, compliant, and easily influenced, a lot like sheep. So one group of people will look at another group of people and say, look how gullible those people are. They'll believe anything. All they're doing is mindlessly going along with the idea or the leader or the perspective that they think will solve their problem and make them happy. What a bunch of sheeple. Especially in the current climate. It has been so easy for me to throw stones like this, to deride and diminish others who are different in one way or another. But here's the rub. Every single one of us is constantly bombarded with messaging that is either designed to make us afraid or offering a solution to our fears. And all of us, at one time or another, will find ourselves susceptible to going along with a crowd that shares our fears and shares our hope for a certain solution. We're like different groups of sheep, making fun of all the other groups for being sheep. And not only are our fears not being resolved, but we're creating new kinds of problems by stoking division and discord even further. So what do we do? How do we acknowledge the realities of legitimate fears and concerns in our world without getting swept up in a senseless stampede? The Christian story offers many profound and transformative resources to address this need, but perhaps none is as widely known and widely loved as the 23rd Psalm. Psalm 23 is only a few lines long, and yet it gives us an entire lens through which we can view our world differently. It shows us how to see where God is present at times and in places where we might think God was absent or are so overwhelmed that we would otherwise miss God being right here with us. The wisdom and the hope of this psalm helps us to engage in our world in a different kind of way. Instead of being controlled by our fear, overcome by loss, or unable to deal with conflict and challenge, the psalm can help us be reoriented to a healthy understanding of God, ourselves, and others. It's for this reason that this psalm is beloved by so many. Countless Christians, Jews, people of other faiths, and people of no faith have found peace and hope in its words. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we want you to join us for the next few weeks as we dive into Psalm 23 line by line. Because we don't want to be people who are driven or manipulated by fear and act out of it in foolish and destructive ways. Rather, our hope is that we would become a fearless flock, entering into the challenges of our world by going with God instead of simply going along. And today, we'll begin by exploring the opening line, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The books of the Bible were written in a predominantly agrarian society, so the image of a shepherd and his sheep were well known. The shepherd led, cared for, and protected a flock of sheep from a myriad of threats and dangers, especially wild animals. But more often than not, the shepherds were protecting the sheep from themselves. Some animals, they're going to do just fine out in the wild, not sheep. There was a reason they needed constant supervision and protection, a lot of reasons. Sheep were just oblivious to the danger around them. They would wander into pits and ravines. Thirsty sheep would wade into a stream, not realize there was a bit of a current going in it. And so when their wool got waterlogged, they wouldn't be able to escape. They'd be swept away. And then they'd get distracted and leave the rest of the flock behind. Here's a picture of a sheep who left the flock, got lost, and was later found with 90 pounds of extra wool because he had no one to cut it off. I remember being in a small group where we were talking about the sheep-shepherd dynamic, and I was sharing some of these thoughts with the group. And a woman who was with us chimed in and said, "I actually grew up raising sheep on a farm." And I thought, shoot, I've been putting down sheep for the past 5 minutes. She's going to call me a sheepist and tell me how wrong I am. But instead, she said with a totally straight face, "It's way worse than you think. Sheep will go to all kinds of improbable lengths to inadvertently endanger themselves. And even when you try to help them out, well, they'll find a way back into trouble." This was especially true when they were afraid, because then all bets were off. Sheep were valuable and important, but they needed the shepherd. And this image has been used to describe God's relationship to God's people since pretty much the beginning. In Genesis 48, Israel prayed that the God who has been the shepherd of all my days would bless his sons. The prophet Isaiah said that God tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. And in Ezekiel, we read an entire proclamation from God that God will be like a shepherd who goes out and regathers his lost flock, because we all, like sheep, have gone astray. God is the shepherd who loves his flock dearly. We and the rest of humanity are that flock. And we have some seriously sheep-like tendencies to us, especially when we're afraid. Throughout the biblical story, there is moment after moment when fear gets the best of God's people. In the very beginning, we see Adam and Eve giving into the fear that God is withholding from them, that they aren't enough in and of themselves. They fear they're missing out, so instead of trusting God or discussing this with God, they reacted anxiously in a way that had devastating consequences. They take the forbidden fruit and fracture their relationship with God and with one another. Many generations later, God delivered the Hebrews out from the oppressive rule of Egypt. They now had freedom, wealth they had taken from Egypt, and the hope of a new life as God's people. But while Moses met with God on the mountain, they became nervous. What if he never comes back? Who would lead or protect them? And in their anxiety and fear, they took their gold and made a calf that they began to worship. Talk about sheeple. Down the road, once God's people had been established in the promised land, they decided that they wanted a king, just like all the other nations. They feared they would be defeated in battle or somehow inferior to the other nations. But God was supposed to be their king. That was what was supposed to make them distinct and special. So God told them, this is a bad idea. But they kept clamoring for a king, so God granted their request. It did not go well. And we just remembered on Good Friday, the crowds that had welcomed Jesus in Jerusalem quickly turned on him once they feared he could not give them what they wanted. They chanted, "Crucify him." And Pilate conceded. In all of these instances, and countless others, fear won the day. Fear of not being enough, fear of not being like other people, fear of other people, fear of their hopes not being realized. Their fears fed off of one another, leading them to make terrible decisions. They had thought that all the things they were moving towards were solutions, things that would fix their fear. Fruit, golden calf, a king, even an execution. But all that those so-called solutions did was further the rift between themselves and each other and themselves and God. They were like sheep without a shepherd, oblivious to the harm that they were wandering into, the harm that they were even encouraging one another towards. You know, these stories are thousands of years old, but they also feel incredibly relevant today. We can easily look around and see the poor decisions that people are making out of fear of not being enough, not having enough, of other people getting a leg up on them, of feeling threatened by differences. And when we're honest with ourselves, we can find ourselves among them. When you feel afraid, what do you run to? What do you try to grab onto? Do you ever find yourself going along with a crowd that only ends up stoking your fears more? My 5-year-old daughter has been on a Little Mermaid kick lately, and we were listening to Ursula's song, Poor Unfortunate Souls, for about the 1000th time, and she said to me, "Isn't it nice how Ursula is trying to help everyone?" I stifled a laugh and I said, "Well, that's not what's really going on here." And we had a little chat about how Ursula is taking advantage of people who are in difficult situations. When we're in a tough spot or feeling afraid, we might not be making a deal with a sea witch, but we can so easily believe that something is going to be good for us when it's just not. It could be money, or power, or silencing those who disagree with us, thoughtlessly embracing an idea or a leader or a celebrity personality that will take us down an attractive but unhealthy path. I wish I could say my antics ended after that freshman year basketball rush, but too many times in moments of fear, I've rushed to social media forums, turned on a podcast to hear someone tell me what I wanted to hear, or sat around and groused with my friends. It felt good in the moment, but I can't say it really addressed my concerns. It gave me a healthier way to relate with God and others. If anything, it just had the opposite effect. I was just wandering into spaces or allowing myself to get dragged into spaces that were more dangerous, more fear and anxiety producing than I realized. Friends, the reality is we are a lot like sheep. We are valuable, but prone to making bad decisions, especially when we're afraid and a herd mentality kicks in, or technically speaking, a flock mentality. We need a shepherd, A shepherd who can guide us along right paths through dark valleys, who can bring us to still waters and green pastures. A shepherd who will keep us from giving into fear and who will restore our souls. And Psalm 23 tells us that the Lord is that shepherd for us. For some of us, we might not like the sound of that. We don't want a shepherd. We don't want to be led. We can make our own choices, do our own thing, be independent and in control. My sense that what's behind this for us is the concern that we won't have the full, real life that we desire if we're somehow caught up in this shepherd-sheep dynamic. We'll be less than what we'd hope for ourselves. And I get that. Especially when so many of the fears that pull at us are trying to eat away at that very ideal. But let me offer a few reflections. The first is simply that we're all being led by something. We're surrounded by things and people that are calling out for our attention, wanting to influence us, wanting us to go along with them. Advertisers, politicians, and social media pundits who want us to keep following them by stoking our fears. And we'll go along with some of them. We don't live as fully independent beings, completely autonomous and impervious to outside influence as much as we might like to think we are. And this ties into my second thought. We weren't created to be that way in the first place. We were created to be dependent upon God and interdependent upon one another. That we are more fully human, not less human, the more we lean into connection with God and others. We wouldn't look at a flock of sheep being led by a shepherd and say, they're doing it wrong. We'd say that's a good thing. And that's the condition that the sheep need to thrive in and grow. Which brings me to my third thought. We know exactly what our shepherd is like because of who Jesus is. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep. My sheep know me. And I lay down my life for the sheep. Jesus is the shepherd who knows us, who loves us, and who goes to extraordinary lengths to lay down his life for us. Why? So that we might have full life. Because unlike others who lead us by making us even more afraid, Jesus leads us by alleviating our fears and replacing them with full life and with love. We've been talking a lot about the first part of Psalm 23's opening line, the Lord is my shepherd. But then the psalmist goes on to say, I shall not want. It probably raises some real questions for us. What does that mean, I shall not want? Am I supposed to renounce all desires? Am I supposed to just be happy about whatever circumstances I find myself in? Or is God just going to give me everything I ever wanted, genie style? I think all of those questions misunderstand what's being said here. It's totally normal to have wants and desires. As Pastor Christian preached in Lent, Jesus asked his followers the question, what do you want me to do for you? And it's not a trick question. The answer isn't nothing. Jesus knows many of our wants and needs are justified because we live in a broken, dangerous, and unjust world. Many of our fears and concerns stem from things that we should rightly see as dangerous. It would be a problem if a sheep weren't afraid of a wolf. And yet, as we also know, just because we follow Jesus does not mean that our lives will be free of pain and struggle. So what do we make of this? Rabbi Harold Kushner, in writing about this psalm, said that a better way to understand this line was, the Lord is my shepherd. What more do I need? Because God's promise is not that we will be safe, but that we will not be alone. That means we can enjoy a full life, not a fearful life. We can trade a life where we might be driven by fear and pulled along by the crowds for a life in which we are being led and cared for by God and part of a community, a flock that is enjoying this same life. Over the next month, we're going to explore much more of what this full life looks like as described in this psalm. But it begins by acknowledging that the Lord is our shepherd. And that means that in moments when we are feeling pulled by fear, we can stop. When we feel that anxiety or that anger or that judgmentalism creeping in, we can press pause. We can remind ourselves that we aren't led by fear. We are led by the Good Shepherd. And when we follow him, then our response to fear can be one of love and self-control. And I want to offer a few ways that we can put this into practice. I didn't get my first cell phone until college, which meant that by the time I had gotten one, I had memorized dozens of phone numbers. My parents, my friends, my relatives, that random girl I met at camp that one summer. Numbers I could call to mind whenever I needed. It was kind of like a superpower, only one that we all had, because our minds can handle that. But once I got a cell phone, all gone. No need to remember those numbers, so I didn't. Usually that's totally fine. But there have been a handful of times where I have been without my phone and I needed to reach someone. And it's honestly been a bit of a coin toss as to whether or not I'll remember my wife's or my parents' numbers in that moment. And the thing is, that's usually when I need to reach them the most. In a similar way, memorizing scripture used to be a regular part of my spiritual life. And it was in the lives of many of my friends and the communities we were a part of. But then once we had access to the Bible just about any time we wanted because of our smartphones, it started to wane. And I feel like we've really lost something. Because it's one thing to be having a conversation with a friend in church about the Bible and to say, oh, where's that verse again? And just, look it up. But it's another thing when I'm in a moment of fear or anger, feeling tempted to lie or cheat or something else, in moments when I need the wisdom and the encouragement of the scriptures the most. I might not have the sense to look up a verse. But if there's a scripture that I can bring to mind, right from my heart, I can preach myself. I can offer comfort to a friend in those times. And that reminder of God's love for me and everyone else can protect me from buying into the fearful lies that are constantly swirling around. So our invitation and challenge to you all during this series is to memorize Psalm 23, to commit it to heart. It's not that long. And chances are you know some of the lines more or less already. Because our hope is that when we are in a situation when we are feeling the pull of fear, being drawn in an unhealthy direction, wanting to fix our fear with a false solution, in the moments when we will need God's word the most, we'll have it. It'll be right there. And we can pause and say to ourselves, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Each week, we'll explore a different line or two, and each week we want you to add those lines to your memory. Have fun with it. Practice it at the dinner table, write it out over your morning coffee, whatever you need to do. Let these words sink into your heart and transform your life. The other thing I'd love for you to consider is your community. This could be your family, small group, your class, your program, an affinity group online, anything. How does your community respond to fear? Do you stoke fear in each other? Do you find yourselves pulling each other towards solutions that end up doing more harm than good? Those solutions could include feeding into an us versus them mentality, numbing out with alcohol or food or video games, or a constant focus on self-improvement. What if instead of just going along, you and your community members step back, pause, and consider, are we just stirring up anxiety? Do we end our times together feeling more stressed or afraid? If so, what are ways that we could encourage one another in the spirit of Psalm 23 to avoid falling into the traps that we're susceptible to? Friends, I think we can start now. I want you to pause. Take a breath. Join me in saying Psalm 23, verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Amen. And thanks be to God.